And joining us now on the debate in Montreal, Quebec, Nick Luca, Professor of Urban Planning and Architecture at McGill University. And with us here in studio, Bob Topp, Chairman of the Coalition After Property Tax Reform, Penny Caldwell, Editor of Cottage Life magazine, and Mark Claremont, Editor and Publisher of the Muskoka to Daily, not today, Muskoka to Daily web newspaper. Great to have everybody around the table here. And Nick, it's nice to have you on the line from Montreal. Before we start our discussion here, let's just put up a bunch of numbers on the screen that we have from Industry Canada and from the town of Parry Sound, Muskoka, Haliburton, and so on and so on. Here's tourism to Northern Ontario in 2008. And even though we know Northern Ontario does not really include Muskoka, they cover it this way, so we will too. Total visits up north, almost 7 million. From the United States, just over 1 million. From Ontario, over 5 million. From the rest of Canada, about 500,000. From overseas, a little north of 60,000. Out of a total of 1.8 million overnight visits to Muskoka, half of them are from Toronto every year. Half from this city alone. Now, what happens in the summertime? We're going to show you through 4 different locales. Parry Sound, the year-round population's 18,000. Look what happens during the summer, up to 60,000. In Muskoka, again, up a bit, 63,000 to 78,000. Haliburton, 16.5, triples. And Kawartha Lakes, 74.3 to more than 104,000. And I'd add to the list, even though we don't have it there, Manitoulin Island, which has 5,000 year-round residents and 50,000 in the summertime. That's another great example of this exodus that takes place during the summertime months. So, Nick, let's get into this. Ontarians seem to love flocking north during the summertime. Can you tell us whether you know this to be a particularly Ontario phenomenon?
That's a great question. It's actually not unique to Ontario by any measure. It's a very Canadian phenomenon, but in the most populous provinces. So Ontario is the leader. Quebec is pretty close behind, similar numbers. And then British Columbia have significant numbers of cottaging households. But we also find this second home, multiple residency practice in many places, intriguingly, that have pretty hefty winters. So the Midwest in the United States, Wisconsin, Minnesota, these sorts of contexts have many second homes. Probably know about Maine, retreat for people from Boston, but also very much in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia as well.
Penny, for those who don't know about this and just don't do this, explain. What's the draw?
Well, it's, you know, the black flies and the mosquitoes and...
But seriously.
Yeah, seriously, I think it's just a sense of getting back to a simpler way of life. And for traditional cottagers, that's exactly what they do. They like to sort of get back to engaging with the natural world, with the wilderness, leaving it all behind, leaving their cares in the city, and just being able to sort of enjoy and decompress.
Decompress. Mark, how would you put it?
Well, I mean, I think it's just this whole lifestyle. It's a culture that the people want to get up there and they want to share. We've got a good thing going on up there, certainly in Muskoka, in central Ontario, all the way from Georgian Bay through Haliburton over to the Ottawa Valley. And so people want to come up and share the lifestyle that we've got. It's casual and it's not sort of a overly relaxed there. You know, we've still got to put a life in and we work every day and we've got to toil 12 months of the year, and it's not just 2 months of the year.
You got a good thing going, but we'll discuss in a few minutes about whether you actually like to share that good thing going.
We do.
Okay, Bob, come on in here. Tell me, what do you think the attraction is for those who are not cottage goers? What do you think it is?
I think, speaking of Muskoka and Parry Sound, I think it's the beauty of the place. It's exceptional. It's recognized around the world as one of the real summer spots, and I think it is particularly attractive, and your numbers show that the exodus from Toronto, so it's a move from urban to cottage country, and it's a natural, if you can get there,
Because anybody who's tried to go up the 400 highway on a Friday night knows sometimes you can't get there.
It's tough. It's
yeah,
really
it
tough.
is.
Yeah.
Nick, try this on for size. Everybody talks about the lifestyle being so much more attractive up there than, you know, possibly it is in the city, where it's, you know, for all of its advantages, it does have so many things going against it in the city. What's so different about the lifestyle in cottage country that makes it so appealing?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that it is just different, and it's a non-work context, and that's a major part of the motivation for people who practice cottage life. And it is a culture, it's a way of life, it's very socially constructed, and it's very meaningful to people. So the attraction is, of course, that you can get away from all of the stresses, all of the requirements of work, all of the trade-offs that you have to make on a day-to-day basis, and you're engaging in almost everything, right down to the kind of dwelling in which you are spending your time, on the basis of choice, rather than having ended up there because of other circumstances. So it really is that people are drawn into a context where they have quite a bit of control. In academic terms, we often talk about agency. People have agency, and they can act more fully and see positive results to their actions in the cottage context. But it's very much a ritual of living in a different context, dwelling in a different space that increases the validity, the meaningfulness, the stuff that makes life pleasurable in both contexts. So the city becomes livable, but also much more lovable, because it's something that you can leave on a regular basis.
Penny, you certainly can get away from all of the things of urban life that make urban life extremely hectic. But I think a lot of us have seen those cottages in Muskoka, and it doesn't look like they're leaving a lot of urbanity behind in the cities.
Yeah.
These are cottages that have, you know, huge satellite dishes and all of the, you know, modern conveniences of home with them.
Yep.
So how much getting away from it is really happening?
Well, I think Muskoka, there has been a lot of development there. You do see a lot of big cottages being built, and that's happening in other places too, but I notice it more there. I think that's the fundamental question is, you know, we try to get away from it all, but in the end, are we bringing it all with us? And as people as people are paying more for their cottages, they want to be able to use them a good deal of the time, so they're making them four-season cottages. And once you have a four-season cottage, you need a good road to get in there. You want to have more amenities. We get into, you know, the kinds of services that you're going to ask from your municipality.
I see cottages with three-car garages now. I mean, it's really kind of funny.
Yep, it's true.
Mark, are you really, you know, are you getting away from it at all by going to Muskoka these days? Seems like a lot of Muskoka is bringing the city up to it now.
Hey, that's great. We're welcome. Our door's open. Gravenhurst is the gateway to Muskoka, and so you're always welcome. Whether it's just weekends or whether it's winter time or anything like that. And we're glad to share what we've got up here. And it's a whole other world up there. You know, we've got the other day bears walking down the main street. Matter of fact, they just did the sidewalks on the main street of Gravenhurst, and they just cemented them there, right? And so there's now a paw print from a bear on the main street there.
What'd they do about that?
Well, I think it's going to be, I'm going to describe his name in there or something.
I'm not worried
like
about the
that
paw
there,
print.
right?
I mean the bear. What did they do about the
Oh,
bear
I see
walking
there,
down the main
right?
street?
Well, I mean, it's just a little bit of an entertainment factor there. And so the other day before, we had a moose in the backyard of somebody in Gravenhurst also. So we've got the natural lifestyle where people are there. And you go to work, and you're here in Toronto where you're bumper to bumper with cars there, right? We drive around the lakes there to work and up and down and all over the place, and it's just seeing scenery there, trees and lifestyle and waterfront and things like that. So,
Bob, it is gorgeous. There's no question about it. It's just spectacularly beautiful the further north of southern Ontario you go. Having said that, it does look as if people who come from the south to go north are trying to bring a lot of the so-called modern conveniences of city life with them. Does that take away, detract from the whole scene?
I think they're the new cottager as opposed to me, the old cottager. I've been there all my life.
Which is where?
In Muskoka. Actually in Seguin Township, which is in the district of Parry Sound, but it's at the north end of Lake Rosso, so it's called Muskoka.
Okay.
The new people, and we've got lots of them, are fairly well off because otherwise they couldn't afford to be new cottagers. You know, some of us who have been there for a long time, we got in at the right time.
What does a waterfront cottage go for these days in Muskoka?
Oh, in the millions.
In the millions?
In the millions. I think average prices are close to $1 million now. That's average sale prices.
So we are not talking about middle-class people, you know, going up for a weekend. We are talking about the rich.
Not the ones that are now arriving where we are. They are arriving, they're building large, substantial, year-round property, cottages with all the goodies.
Nick, you want to come in on that?
I just wanted to jump in and give you a very interesting sort of factoid. About 6 years ago, we passed a very important threshold. The average cost of a waterfront house or cottage in Ontario surpassed the average cost of a house in Toronto. So that is a pretty significant change when you consider that historically a cottage was, in a sense, an affordable way to have a getaway that was really sort of, it's still counted for statistical purposes by the federal government as a household amenity, as a kind of a perk, like having a skidoo or a yacht or anything like that.
Isn't that fascinating? Let me hear from Mark and then Penny on that.
Yeah, just on the real estate side, right now there's 193 properties that are in Muskoka that are listed at over $1 million there, right? And there's in the $500,000 to $900,000 range, which is the most popular range. There's about 224, and $300,000 to $500,000 there's $1,000. That's 207 properties for sale. Now you figure that the average home in a place like downtown Gravenhurst, nice new retirement homes there, 250 or something like that. So these are pretty extensive properties that you're talking about there, and so and probably they'll be all listed, but maybe a third of them will sell in this year. And so last year they had $180 million worth of sales of cottages in Muskoka. And this year they're already up to $146 million. So there was a market correction in 2008 where things went down about 15%. And now they've rebounded there.
Do they have a municipal land transfer tax there?
Yes.
They must be getting pretty rich off that thing.
Rich is a...
Okay, is a relative term,
yeah.
I hear you. Penny, you wanted to say.
I think, too, one of the reasons that Muskoka is so popular and desirable, pushing the market up there, is that it's very close to Toronto, you know, relatively. You can get there in 2 hours, an hour and a half for some people. And if you go farther away from urban centers, you'll find that the price of cottages comes down. So I don't think it's usual to find $1 million cottages in the other parts of the province. For example, this morning I got an email from a guy who's in Moonbeam, Ontario, which is up near Kapuskasing, and you can still get cottages on that lake for $70,000. So I think that...
How far a drive is that?
Well, for him, he was telling me about a 9-hour drive he had in a snowstorm once, and that's the trade-off, exactly.
Yeah, that's not a place you go for the weekend. Yeah. Penny, while you've got the floor, let me try this. How do you make $1 million cottage worth $2 million? You make sure it's the last one. That's what they say. How does the local impulse to economic development square off against the desire of those who are already there to preserve what is pristine and pure there?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a key question. You know, cottagers, and Bob was talking about the difference between the old cottages and the old-time cottagers and the newcomers. The thing cottagers want the most is for it never to change. You know, they want to be able to get up in the summer and find everything is exactly the way they left it the year before. That's not always what a township needs. You know, it's not the economic reality for municipalities who need development for growth of the town. And that's a fundamental issue.
Nick, maybe give us a bit of a history lesson here before we go further on that. The social and economic profile of the mix of people in cottage country over the last 100 years, how's it changed?
Yes. The change has been what would be called in an urban context gentrification. We're seeing wealthier people with high earning power, much more highly educated, and engaged in very specialized areas of work within the division of labor. So 100 years ago, which is really the tail end of logging in Muskoka and Haliburton, we saw people who were engaged in productive relationships with the landscape, but lived on a subsistence basis. They were people who were working as farmers where they could find enough soil to grow crops, which was very rare, and as loggers, and doing a sort of a pioneer sort of work. But then increasingly what happened is there was an influx of people who were wealthy, and then there was a second wave of people who were more middle class, and in the last 20 years or so we've seen really that it's becoming more of the preserve of the elite, especially with reference to the clarification that Penny gave us, within 3 hours drive, let's say, of Metro Toronto, of the old Metro or the city of Toronto. So there's been a real increase in the value of waterfront property, and most people, it could be said with fairness, have been priced out of the market now.
Bob, you want to follow on that?
Yeah.
Well, the elitism is something that we've struggled with because the perception of cottagers, and he's absolutely right, the new guys are well off, or they couldn't afford to be there. But those of us who've been there a long time are being dragged through this increase in market value, which of course has clobbered us on the property tax side.
So your property taxes are going up significantly because of the gentrification.
No, well, they're going up significantly because of the increase in value of land. And I think the increase in value of land is driven by the closeness to, as Penny says, to the city, and the lack of availability of waterfront.
But do you know people who are actually having to sell their cottages because they can't afford the the higher property taxes? That does happen now.
We do, it does happen. And I can just tell you my taxes have gone from $2,000 to $8,000 in a decade. And that is not untypical. So that's what, and what's happening is it's shifting the tax load onto waterfront and away from off waterfront. It's a huge shift that's taken place.
Penny?
The other aspect of it is that when people have had a cottage in the family for many generations and have passed down, they're not in cottaging because they're wealthy. They're there because they're fortunate.
Right. And
they often understand that, but the new generation isn't able to keep the cottage. And so we do find, especially with the big waterfront cottages, I heard of one just recently in Muskoka. It had been in the family for many generations, and they are selling it because they can't keep it. So it's not people who are cottagers who have had it for a long time. They just aren't able to stay in the game.
Well, on the other hand, Mark, the municipality itself, I don't know how much it cares about who lives in the cottage, other than the fact that it's there, that the taxes are going up, that McMansions are being built around it.
Right.
That's all good for assessment. That's all good if you want to spend property tax dollars on better services for the locals. Right. That's how you do it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I spent 7 years on the district council and the town council just until this last election, and so I know, I'm acquainted with this. But I mean, I spoke to the former minister, Andy Mitchell. He was our MP for many years before Tony Clement unseated him. And I used to ask him, he gets around the world, and I said, what do you think of, what do people say when you say that I'm the member of parliament for Parry Sound, Muskoka? What do they think of? Hockey players and
Bobby
movie
Orr.
stars.
Yeah,
there.
Bobby Orr.
Yeah, absolutely. They don't think of hockey players and hookers or anything like that, eh? But I mean, certainly, there's a wealth of people who have moved into the community, and the community is welcoming of those because they do bring an economic stimulus to the area.
Well, you know what? I got some numbers on that. Forgive the interruption, but as long as we're on this, Michael, let's bring up this one here. This is the median incomes in Ontario, private households. Let's bring this graphic up. Province-wide, median income for a private household is about $60,000, a little north of that. As rich as we think Muskoka is, look for the people who live there. Look at it. It's less than the provincial average. How about in Haliburton, also a place with a lot of big cottages? $45,000. Kawartha Lakes, almost $53,000. Parry Sound, again, you may think of it as a very big place, $46,000. So is it fair to say, Nick, that regions like this really need that influx of city people because, you know, their household incomes would not suggest that they make enough to have the kind of lifestyle they want to have?
It's correct. It's a really, really difficult situation because the economy really has its lifeblood because of tourism. And we include in tourism cottaging. People are living year-round in many instances. They're practicing a kind of residential tourism. And the property tax base is a main source of income for these rural municipalities, as is the case for all municipalities under our tax system. And the problem is, going back to that question of if the municipalities are interested in seeing an increase in their revenues, or certainly keeping the revenues stable from the property taxes, etc., then they won't be interested necessarily in who's living in those waterfront dwellings or what they look like. And yet, because cottage country is precisely an amenity landscape, and people, they place value on this kind of context because it is beautiful, because it's experientially good, there's a tipping point, right? So the density of dwellings, the visual and other sensory qualities that come with having too many people or passing a certain density of people, the built form, the way in which vegetation is treated, naturalized or natural shorelines versus artificial shorelines with retaining walls, these can actually really screw up the value. So there is a sort of a limit to how much development can be handled before you start to undermine the value. And we've actually seen that quite a bit in contexts such as Lake Simcoe, which many people say that's not cottage country anymore, it's just
No.
a suburb. It's a bunch of suburban houses on the waterfront. And ironically, and I've found this a lot in the studies I've done of residential mobility, people have said, well, you know, we love this lake, but it's becoming so urban or suburban or whatever that we're going to now buy a new place which is 100 kilometers farther north.
Yeah.
So in this sense, the cottage phenomenon in Ontario, in central Ontario, because it's so tied to Toronto, is a kind of suburbanization. And we see that in many contexts. Stockholm, in fact, Vienna has that, that pattern as well. We see that the metropolitan region includes the cottage landscape. I would say then, in terms of the users and the costs, et cetera, I think that we're hearing this consistently from everybody on the panel. There are sort of three sociological groups. It's not great to generalize, but three sociological groups in cottage country. You have the people who are the locals who don't have waterfront land, who have often been there for generations, engaging in some kind of productive relationship, logging, subsistence farming, etc. Often they're now involved as
Mark, give me the next two quickly, because I got other stuff I want to cover here.
And then the other two, yes, very quickly.
Excuse me, Nick.
Yeah, no, that's fine. The other two are the old cottagers, and I'm not an imposter entirely because I'm from an Ontario cottaging family. People who started cottaging 100 years ago or sometime before the Second World War, and are there because it's a pleasurable place but have modest incomes. And then the third generation, the new, the third group is the new cottagers, the people who are coming in and building really extravagant houses.
Right. Mark Claremont wanted to follow.
Yeah, and Nick is right. There used to be tourism. There used to be itinerant day trippers who come up here. People trying to get away from the heat of the city because they didn't have air conditioners in the 1920s, and they came up for the fresh air and the relaxation. But now we're relying on cottaging, which is the real industry there. But it's not just a season of, it's not even 2 months there. Our weekend is actually sort of like a May 24th to the CNE. And that's when we have to crowd in everything. And it's actually not even those 6 weeks there or 8 weeks there. It's like 3 days on each weekend. So you got 6 weekends, so it's like 18 days. But we still have to be a 4 seasons community. We have to still live there fall, winter, summer, and spring there, right? So we can't just rely on a few people coming up there for a few days. So we've got to have a lifestyle and an economy that speaks to the whole season,
well, let me go to Bob on that, because we have heard of cities and we have heard of idiots. And I have just today, in doing research for this, heard of this expression, cityots, which I've never heard of before. But how much antipathy is there towards the cityots who come up there for 2 months in the summer and may mess around with what you've got going 12 months of the year?
I think the distinction is blurring a lot because what's happening now is a lot of people, and for often financial reasons, are selling their city homes and moving up north. And this could be Muskoka, it could be Collingwood, it could be a number of places. Well, these are retirees, and they're young retirees. And they're up there, and they have energy, and they're contributing to the local community. And I think this is, I'll give you an example. Our reeve of our township and our local councillor are both former summer people who have moved up north and are involved in local politics. And I think you're seeing a blending of the local and the summer population through that phenomenon.
So Penny,
I see a big change.
The one-time antipathy you might have seen towards the cityots is less, do you think, nowadays?
I don't know if it's less. I think it varies from region to region. I think you can get...
Okay, who hates the city folks the most?
I think sometimes it's neighbors. You know, there's antipathy among cottage neighbors because cottagers are so different. You know, you'll have one cottager who really wants to preserve the water, who has a shoreline buffer zone so that he doesn't get toxic runoff into the lake. And then the guy next door has a whole bunch of jet skis and loud music and a lawn right down to the waterfront. And these guys have to exist side by side. So
It's
I
between cottagers.
between cottagers almost as much as between cottagers and local residents.
But there's not one geographic region you'd point to and say, yeah, right there, they particularly don't like the city folks coming up for those 2 months in the summer.
I haven't heard that.
Haven't heard that?
No.
Yeah, there are competing visions clearly amongst people who the existing population and the people who come in there on the weekends or the summer and that sort of thing, and they don't want to see development or anything like that. But we have to have that development, amenities, so that you can come up there. We can't just run a grocery store and open it up on the weekends in the summer and things like that. We have to have the existing infrastructure, whether it's roads or garbage pickup or anything you want there, policing service. And this is the season when you start seeing, unfortunately, tragic accidents. There was three people in a canoe and one guy drowned at Pickerel Lake last weekend there. You see more car accidents, more drinking and driving there. And then we had a very tragic incident a couple of years ago where 3 young people died up in the Lake Joseph area there. And they've been out drinking and went to a resort and things like that, and things got out of hand. Not to say the local people don't do that occasionally or anything like that. But it's a busier area, and I know those numbers you were talking about. It's like 250,000 people who come up here all summer and things like that. But then there's the day trippers there too. So it's an exploding population there, and we all have to live together, and we all have to share it, and we can. And thank God for a number of people, the Cottagers Association, who've insisted that we improve the waterfront and the lakes. And we've actually got some of the best lakes in all of North America, certainly the most studied lakes here, because they forced us. And so the water that we're putting in, taking out of the lakes and recycling back into some of the best in the world, because we've got the best water treatment plants, and so there's a cost to that,
Sure.
right?
Somebody's
got to pay that.
Let me call a bit of an audible here. We had Tony Clement, the Conservative cabinet minister, on the program yesterday. And I've been to his riding, and there's a corner store in his riding called Zanetti's.
Port Sydney.
In Port Sydney, that's right.
Beautiful.
And, you know, Zanetti's Italian.
Yeah.
And that's considered exotically ethnic in that part of the province. Now, in Toronto, obviously, or other big cities around the province, you know, in the school board here, you speak 130 different languages. Nick, let me start with you on this. How open is rural Ontario and cottage country to what you, I guess, we don't like to call, but for lack of a better expression, so-called ethnic Canada?
That's a really tricky question, and not just because I'm speaking from Quebec, where, of course, we've had a lot of sort of infamous struggles. I think that there is an openness. There are no hang-ups culturally or socially. There's no resistance. There was historically. Cottage waterfront properties are very well known in the academic literature as places where there were protective covenants. There was a lot of gatekeeping. So Jewish people were not allowed on certain lakes. My mother's family was Catholic, and they couldn't get into Muskoka, so they went to the south shore of Georgian Bay. That's really faded with time. But as you said, the Italian name is considered exotic. One of the really fascinating phenomena is that the new waves of immigrants that we've seen come to Ontario and to Canada in the last 50, 60, 70 years have not taken any kind of active interest in large numbers in the ritual of going to a lake in cottage country. My father's Hungarian, and he's a great example of this. He doesn't see any value or any attraction in going to a second dwelling, having to manage it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not a resistance. There's just sort of a self-selection process. And when you factor in the cost, the sheer dollar cost of maintaining a second home and then traveling on a regular basis, what you get is a strangely sort of a socio-cultural cleavage between old Canadians who are from Northwest Europe and new Canadians who come from pretty much everywhere else.
Sure. Let me get Bob and Penny on that as well. Bob?
I think they're all the old interesting about Catholics not being let. That's the first time I've heard that. But yeah, I could see that happening. I know in Rosso back in the 40s there was a Jewish hotel because I think the Monteith Inn, they couldn't get into other hotels, so they had their own hotel, which ultimately burned to the ground, burning at both ends at the same time, apparently. So anyway, that's just a story.
Wow. There you go.
But no, if I can move just a little bit away from that to the...
Well, don't move too far, because I want to hear from Penny first on it then.
Okay,
I'll come back
go
to
ahead.
Penny, how about that? Is cottage country open to diversity?
It's a hard question to answer. We certainly are seeing, Cottage Life has a big consumer show twice a year, and I think I've been to 18 shows over the years, and I've certainly noticed recently that there are more visible minorities coming to the shows, talking about cottages, interested in, you know, where to buy. But we also hear about issues where there's been an incident in cottage country. A few years ago, I had a guy come to me at the show. He was interested in getting into cottage country. He was Asian. He was very concerned about the safety of his family and his children. And
Concerned from what standpoint?
He was concerned about whether they would be abused either verbally or physically.
What'd you tell him?
I told him that I thought that, you know, I hadn't heard that question before. Honestly, I was a little bit taken aback. I haven't heard that question more, but now I think we've talked about it, you know, about whether there is a problem in cottage country this way. I think rural Ontario is still very much sort of a white dominated place, you know, places. I hope that it will come. You know, I think that the integration that you mentioned at the beginning of school children in Toronto will mean that new generations, there's a very little, people don't think about racial lines anymore. And I think that as we get into third and fourth generation immigrants, we're going to have those people adopt the culture and the tradition of going to the cottage, as Nick pointed out.
Mark?
Well, I think it's ludicrous to have this discussion and to perpetuate this myth around this table that the rural communities of Ontario are unwelcoming or unaccepting.
I don't think anybody said that.
Well, it sounds to me as though you're saying that people are if I go up there, I feel fearful of going into the country. I mean, are we afraid of bears? Are you afraid of moose? Are you afraid of the people or anything like that?
I will go on the record as saying I am afraid of bears.
Yeah,
yes,
okay, well, you should be there. They're wandering the streets of Gravenhurst there. But I mean, clearly, you know, that's part of it. We live with the bears. I mean, it's a novelty there, right? I mean, people talk, they look at it, and they see
Let's just start. Let's just be clear about this. You know, there may not be much demand by so-called diverse Ontario to go into cottage country at this stage.
Let me just say.
So I'm asking the question from that standpoint.
It's a very famous area for fishing there. It had a little downtime during the acid rain period. But there's a lot of people who are East Asian there or lower European people there who are living in Toronto and their families and descendants. They want to go up and they fish. They come up, they fish. But it's access to the lakes that we're having trouble with. We've got cottagers there who are restricting the use. They're saying that these are our lakes there, and we don't want you coming up and using our lakes there, right? They're public lakes, just like public highways and public roads there. And they're restricting access by having just one public docking facility to get into those smaller lakes I'm talking about. But you're talking about the Lake Muskoka because there's plenty of access points. But the whole community is open and welcome to anybody. We've got a lot of people we've used in recent years where the resorts are dying off there, right? And so they're being replaced by cottagers. And so the workers now, at one time used to have the cottagers' sons and daughters now they're bringing in high-end 5-star resorts there at these Rossos and Taboos and Gravenhurst, which used to be in Muskoka Sands. And now they're being brought in from islands because they say they can't get workers, either local or city kids, to fill those jobs.
Okay, Nick, a follow on that?
I wanted to, that last point is a really important one because the decline in resorts, tourism patterns have changed, etc., mean that there aren't entry points. There aren't easy ways to get a flavor or a taste of what cottage life is like. And a lot of people historically got into cottaging because they said, let's go up to this lodge on lake whatever for a weekend, and they discovered that they loved the land, or they found that the fishing was great, or any number of things. And so they started strategizing to actually procure a property. I think that the point about there being openness is very important. There's no resistance. I don't think there's any more ambivalence or antipathy toward new Canadians or the diversity of cultures that makes up the country in Ontario cottage country, that more than anywhere else in the country.
No, I understand.
Really,
Nick, would you agree though that would you agree that I mean there's some resistance to diversity in the big cities? It strains credulity to think that there isn't any in cottage country, and therefore I'm asking the question about it.
Yes, I think there's as much resistance in any context. There's just there's a greater familiarity in the city context, because when we look at migration patterns and immigration patterns in particular, people who come to Canada move to large cities and really
Right.
to the three major centers. And so the absence, this is of course the struggle we have in Quebec,
Okay.
the absence of people who are visually different and then culturally different in terms of social practice just means that they remain exotic, mysterious, and then for some people or to some
Understood.
extent.
Let me
perhaps
jump
a
in
bit
because
threatening.
I promised Bob we'd get back to the point he wanted to make. We got
Yeah.
a couple of minutes to go here, Bob. So do you want to make
Well,
that point now?
Commenting on the exclusivity of the lakes, and I think that's absolutely true. But that's changing because of the whole timeshare phenomenon. If you
Yes.
can't afford a cottage, and most people can't afford a cottage unless they go to Kapuskasing or somewhere further north, which makes weekends difficult, they get a timeshare on the bottom of Lake Joseph, and for not too bad a cost. And so it opens the area up for sure.
That's still affordable.
That's still
Time
affordable.
can still make it happen.
Still, and
Okay.
there are lots of them.
Penny, with about a minute to
And
go
it's
here. All right, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it's a very important, I think, way. It replaces, in some respects, the resorts. It's obviously a different price and time scale, but it provides an access point for people who don't have or don't want to commit all of the equity or the $1 million in cash to buying a waterfront cottage.
Gotcha. Penny, if you can do it in 20 seconds, what's the biggest challenge cottage country's got right now going forward for the next generation?
I think it's the environment. I think it's maintaining the pristine quality of the lakes and other waterways.
Sums it up nicely, puts a bow on top of it. We thank you all for coming in tonight to talk about this. Nick Luca, the professor of planning and architecture at McGill University. It's good of you to be there on the line for us from Montreal, Quebec. Penny Caldwell from Cottage Life, longtime Georgian Bay cottager. Bob Topp, the Coalition After Property Tax Reform, CAPTOR, there's a nice acronym for you. And Mark Claremont from Muskoka to Daily.com. We'll look for your work and pictures that you were snapping during the course of this show. We'll look for them online on your website. Thanks, everybody.